So I claim no particular privilege in making this report on behalf of others. I think in English, I would say I fell on my sword to take this one on. Most of the work of coordination of these two working groups has been taken on by Petra Hermankova, but she's on leave at present. So I've taken on presenting what is going on. Both working groups, to some degree, the coordination has been taken on for the time being by the FAIR Epigraphy project, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a presentation this afternoon, simply because that provides some of the human resource, the time and the people who can actively coordinate on this. I'll talk first about vocabulary and secondly about ontology. The vocabulary group, I apologize in advance if I have missed anybody off the list, and it's quite possible that I have. The vocabulary group has met relatively frequently, particularly in the first half of the last 12 months, slightly less frequently, more recently, online. The current work of that group can all be found via the Epigraphy.info working group page, which will link you to the Google Drive, where all of the different documents that the group is working on are contained. The vocabulary group as a whole, for those not previously familiar with it, is very much focused around taking on and developing the work that was largely started by the Eagle project of attempting to align and consolidate standardized reference vocabularies for the different concepts and terminologies that we use in epigraphy, and which, with the growth of the sorts of digital projects that we're particularly interested in within Epigraphy.info, need to be as aligned and interoperable as possible. And there is still some way to go in that project overall. And so the vocabulary group is a group of interested volunteers trying to consolidate that work and take it forward. The work of the group has largely focused in, particularly since the last meeting, in focusing on perhaps the most problematic of those different vocabularies, namely the inscription type vocabulary, which the problems are exemplified by the existing Eagle one, which has a very large number of terms drawn from multiple projects, and where problems remain still of linguistic translation between equivalent terms, but also broader problems which go far beyond simply the multiple projects that we have and the multiple vocabularies, where if you think about the nature of inscription type categories that we currently use, many of those conflate object with type. So if one's talking about instrumentum domesticum or curse tablets, or most egregiously graffiti, there are confusions here between different categories, in fact, and not simply inscription type is the same or overlaps with execution type, with object type, sometimes with material, and these need separating. Working on the inscription type, the primary work, which was already well advanced the time of the last meeting, was to try and also identify a set of top-level categories, if you like, to create a hierarchy within inscription type, so that there were approximately 15 top-level categories that every one of the multiple more complex types could be inserted within as a way of trying to align existing material. But the discussion quickly moved further to much more interesting areas addressing the problem I just mentioned of the conflation of concepts and categories in the existing typologies, to a very rich discussion around the possibility of really quite seriously redefining how we approach inscription type with a richer set of distinct conceptual categories, some of which were suggested revolved around the context, so military context, legal context, so on, activity. Better way of thinking about building inscriptions is that they involve the activity of construction, but they also have a legal context, for example, in many cases. Function, so an honorific inscription. The sphere, which is not a satisfactory word in English, but was to capture the very loosely public-private, but that itself is a complex set of categories. And authority, drawn to some extent on the parallel of numismatic typologies, who is responsible for the production of the text. And you can see that those are not in themselves unproblematic still as separations. However, there was a serious concern then within those discussions that, in a sense, we were trying to run before we could walk, to use an English expression, and that before we actually moved to trying to create a wholly new conceptual framework, what remains essential is the work of aligning existing projects and enabling all of the existing projects to align before we ever suggest that projects should now try and integrate what they've got with a completely new framework, which is clearly not going to succeed. And so the current focus goes back to a work of trying to collate existing authority lists from current and past projects and simply to align those. So a continuation essentially of the original work of the Eagle project as a fundamental first step before we can then think about both putting those into a hierarchy and then potentially realigning them with new conceptual categories. In the course of those discussions, a number of other vocabularies have also been identified as being potentially desirable, reflecting some of the different projects that are participating in those discussions. So a set of defined terms that will allow us to classify prose and verse and beyond, and how exactly that is best integrated to existing projects. That obviously reflects the growing number of projects focusing particularly on verse inscriptions at the moment. The question of authority touched on previously, and also a classification for religion. Now, in some cases, good vocabularies do already exist elsewhere for these terms, so it largely comes down to no more than agreeing on which is, if you like, the preferred one to recommend. So that's essentially where the vocabularies work has got to at this point. Moving to ontologies, there's essentially been one brief meeting of the ontology working group, I think, in the last 12 months. There's been less community work in this area so far, partly because the paper that was produced by a large group of contributors, including several in this room, and particularly Pietro Liuzzo, establishing a preliminary ontology for working in epigraphy is already an extremely well-developed and viable first working framework and document for that, and that can be reached through the ontologies working group page. It should also be noted that there is parallel work going on, which that ontology makes very extensive use of, and is presented in a poster at this meeting by Achille Felicetti and Morano, which is around the development of the CRM text extension to the CDOC CRM conceptual framework, which is very widely used, particularly within the museum sector, and provides a very useful basis of an existing rich ontology that we should be integrating with. The work on ontology at this point has very much been taken on by the FAIR Epigraphy project, which I and Marietta Horster, who will be here later, co-direct together with Petra, not Peter, apologies, Petra Hermankova, and Imran Asif, because within that project, we now have a dedicated semantic web developer in the form of Imran Asif, who can start to actually implement and model some of this work for us. And all of this work is accessible on the GitHub repository for FAIR Epigraphy, which I'll talk about this afternoon. But what we have been able to do using the existing ontology created by the working group back in 2021 was actually do a proof of concept and demonstrate that this is entirely doable already. I can't remember if I can. Yes, you can. That's all right. On that. Can't see it on this one, but you can see it on that. And so, and you can visit this already if you go to inscriptiones.org, which is the domain that we've created for all of this work. This project simply took 150 inscriptions out of 3 existing open access Epidoc projects. So the iSicily project, the Greek inscriptions of Cyrenaica project, and the Roman inscriptions of Britain project, and simply walked those Epidoc files through some X-triple templates using the ontology and generated a set of RDF triples from them, and then made them accessible and browsable with an associated Sparkle query, which enables one to simply browse, therefore, through a simple web interface across those inscriptions, across core metadata, to actually be able to access the texts of those inscriptions as well within the browser, and to, for instance, approach them through a map, so on. And all of this was possible within a couple of days for an experienced semantic web developer, which is to say that the ontology is actually impressively robust already and effective. At the same time, if one produces a visualization of the concepts across, in this case, the RDF graph for, if this is an inscription in iSicily, which is, so it's this iSicily inscription. It's also in Klaus Slaby and Heidelberg and Roma. and this uses a series of properties from a range of existing ontologies following the proposed framework that the community developed. Some things you can see very clearly work. So all of these express a preferred identifier, and so we find that they all align very happily on the Trismegistos number, and that is readily extractable. But you will see that they all, for instance, can be made to converge on Latin as the writing system. You can see points where it doesn't quite yet work. So extraction of object type gets one data strings that don't yet align because they're just free text strings, and there's not yet quite sufficient alignment on the underlying vocabularies that may be being used there. And that points to the fact that the single most useful thing that we can actually do at this point is a further alignment of precisely the vocabularies, particularly for metadata, because the broad framework can be shown to work. And it's really around that alignment of metadata that is the key. But that has the potential very easily and quickly, actually, to get us to a version of a devolved corpus model where one can serialize core data out of every project into RDF using that framework, put all of that into a single space, and it is then accessible and queryable very easily for any researcher. That potentially provides a framework for adding new information as well, so that one can imagine a framework where you have corpora projects building additional data, but you have researchers working on their own projects, enriching that data, and both of those potentially coming together into a single store, which is in turn the research resource for the whole community, and avoids us needing, as it were, the single master corpus in that approach. With that in mind, since there is still work to be done on the ontology itself, it's not perfect, it's very good, but it's not perfect. And at the same time, it needs to be, the work on that needs to be concentrated in the primary areas that would be useful to the community in terms of questions that people want to ask. It seemed to me that at this point for a breakout session, the single most useful thing would be to sit down with those who are interested and simply go over the sorts of questions you actually would want to ask of such a hypothetical data set of material across multiple epigraphic corpora. What are the researcher questions? Because that's what the ontology should be aiming to achieve, to make it possible to ask those questions and get the answers back. So for those who are interested, it's essentially a brainstorming session of thinking through the sorts of research questions that you might want to ask across existing or hypothetical future epigraphic corpora. Not a single one, but multiple ones.